Next up, I'm pleased to introduce Randolph Brazier, who is Director of Innovation and Electricity Systems at the Energy Networks Association in the UK. Randolph is responsible for a broad range of strategic and policy initiatives, including the development of smart grids, facilitation of new markets, and the rollout of low-carbon technologies. He engages with the EU, UK government, regulators, and energy industry stakeholders to highlight the need for innovation and a coordinated approach. He previously worked in the design and management of multidisciplinary projects in the power and renewable sectors in the UK, Europe, and Australia. He has a master's in philosophy and engineering for sustainable development from the University of Cambridge and is a regular presenter and panelist at a wide range of innovation and low carbon events and conferences. This morning, Randolph will be speaking to us about the progress that has been made in integrating DERs into the UK's electricity grid and the growing role of DERs in meeting system needs. Randolph will be presenting for 25 or 30 minutes or so, and we should have 15 or 20 minutes at the end of Randolph's presentation for questions from the audience. So I do encourage you to submit questions to us using the question feature, and you can also raise your hand, and we'll plan to call on a few of you at the end of Randolph's presentation. So with that, please take it away, Randolph, and thanks for joining us this morning.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Colin. Hopefully you can all hear me and see my slides there. But it's wonderful to be here today. I agree that there's a really good turnout and a great bunch of people here. So I'm really happy to be here and give you a view from the other side of the pond. So if we could just move on to the first slide, I'll explain what we do. So I work for a company called the Energy Networks Association in the UK. And we represent all of the gas and electricity networks at both transmission and distribution level in the UK and Ireland. So on that slide on the screen there, in the top two boxes, you can see our electricity members. On the left, you've got what we call the DNOs, the distribution networks. And on the right, you've got the transmission owners. And that includes National Grid ESO, which is our equivalent of the IESO for you guys. And then down the bottom, you've got our gas network equivalents. So on the bottom left, you've got the gas networks, we call them GDNs, and on the right, our gas transmission company. And as you can see there, we've got very large networks with lots of customers and lots of investment, as I'm sure it's the same over there in Canada. So as you can see on the next slide, was really, oh, sorry, previous slide on the challenge. Yep. So this was actually really well set out by Leslie as well. We're facing a similar challenge here in the UK to you guys. Effectively, we have traditionally had a one-way power system with less than 100 large fossil fuel and nuclear generators that produced power and transmitted it in one direction down to homes and businesses. And we're moving towards a world where we've got distributed generation and distributed energy resources connected at all voltage levels and all parts of the energy system. Power's flowing in all different directions, and we've got new large-scale loads coming onto the power system, such as electric vehicles and potentially heat pumps as well. And this challenge is being driven by what we call the 3 Ds: digitalization, decentralization, and decarbonisation. Although I would probably say that decarbonisation is the biggest driver amongst those. And if we move on to the next slide, I'll explain why. Thanks, Arturo. So in the UK, net zero and the drive towards decarbonisation has been heavily supported by government policy. So we have a 2050 net zero target, which was announced by Theresa May, the first Western country to do so. That was then backed up with an energy white paper with a range of different actions to help achieve net zero. And similarly, the Prime Minister's 10-point plan. All of these policies are then backed up by further policy to effectively promote low carbon technologies and innovation. And I'm going to talk a little bit later about one of these innovation programs that we help facilitate at ENA. And more recently, we've obviously had the tragic COVID-19 pandemic, but we have been working with the Prime Minister and government to use this as an opportunity to build back better, as we say. And one of the ways we've done this, for example, is agreeing £300 million of network investment to accelerate and speed up effectively green projects that will help us build back better. All of this sort of government policy that we've got in the UK, which is a critical starting point, is then backed up with quite a strong and innovative regulatory model. And if we move on to the next slide, I'll explain that in a bit more detail. Thank you very much. So in Great Britain, the Northern Ireland has a different regulator, but in Great Britain, Ofgem is the regulator for gas and electricity markets. As I mentioned earlier, all of the networks in GB at least are unbundled in line with EU law. And we have a regulatory model called RIIO, R-I-I-O. It stands for Revenue Equals Incentives plus Innovation plus Output. And what's so impressive about this regulatory model is that it's a performance-based or output-based framework. So effectively, the networks, our members, they are judged on and they are incentivized to deliver outputs to customers, not necessarily just caring about the inputs and building more networks, for example. It's the outputs for customers that matter most. That is quite an innovative regulatory model. Not many other countries have such a model. And it has been really successful in driving down costs for customers, incentivizing innovation, and enabling new markets. And I'm going to talk a little bit later about how it's helping to enable these new markets. Could we move on to the next slide, please? So what does this mean in terms of actual numbers and getting actual things connected? So as you can see on the screen here, I've got a few facts and figures. So last year, in terms of volume of energy, we had 43% renewables across the year. That goes up to around 60-odd% if you include nuclear power from a low carbon perspective. But that's obviously across the whole year. But we have had certain periods where we've had even higher penetration than that. And to be honest, these slides are out of date almost as soon as I present them, because we're breaking records all the time. So you can see there on the 21st of May, about a month ago, for a couple of hours, we had purely wind, onshore and offshore, generating around about 62.5% of the electricity mix. And I've heard for years how, you know, we can't have 20% renewables, we can't have 30%, we can't have 40%. Oh, there's no way we can have more than 50%. And we cracked 60% of purely wind. We've got over 500,000 EVs on the roads now. That's not too high in terms of absolute numbers, but the growth rates are high. And the month-on-month sales figures are in the double digits in terms of percentage. We've got around 30 gigawatts of distributed generation connected to the DNO networks at the distribution level, and around 85% of that is renewable, mainly wind and solar. We've got the largest portfolio of hydrogen projects in the world, and that's actually what the image is on the right there. That's our suite of hydrogen projects that we're running with our membership. We have the world's largest local flexibility markets, which I'm not going to mention right now. I'm going to talk about a bit later. And all while maintaining a very reliable system as yours is over there as well. However, while this is obviously a very good start, there's still a huge scale up required to reach net zero. and there's still a lot to do. So the way we are doing that and the way we're coordinating that is via our next slide, please. So we have two projects at ENA, two strategic projects, which are looking at effectively delivering net zero from a networks perspective. From an electricity perspective, we have the Open Networks project, that's the one on the left. And then on the right, we have our Gas Goes Green project. So the Open Networks project is what I'm going to focus mainly on today, and I'm going to talk about how we're delivering the smart grid. But just briefly on Gas Goes Green, decarbonising our gas grid is absolutely critical to achieving net zero. Around about 85% of homes and businesses in the UK have a gas connection, a connection to the gas networks for the purposes of heating and cooking or hot water. And we obviously need to decarbonise that. So we're looking at decarbonising the gas networks and moving them either towards, well, possibly some biomethane, but you know, the most likely candidate at this stage is a hydrogen economy. That's not to say there won't be electrification as well. Obviously, particularly with transport, there's going to be a lot of electrification, and no doubt some of the heating will be electrified as well. However, we do believe that we need to very much take local solutions, and there'll be different solutions in different areas across the country. And hence that's why these two projects work hand in hand. They actually have a common work stream as well. And we don't believe that net zero is possible to achieve without taking this whole system coordinated approach. But as I said, today I'm going to mainly focus on the Open Networks project. So if we move to the next slide, I'll introduce that. Thank you very much. So as I mentioned, this is our flagship project for effectively delivering the smart grid. That, if you were to boil it down to one sentence, that's what it's going to be doing. The aim of the project is to effectively deliver for customers a smart grid while lowering their costs, enabling them to access new revenue streams, and obviously maintaining our security of supply, keeping the lights on. This project has been identified as a key project within the government and our regulator. And in fact, they've written it into the government's Smart Systems and Flexibility Plan. They've effectively said government and industry will work together via this project to help deliver the smart grid. And as I kind of indicated with Rio, innovation is quite a critical part of what we do at the networks, and it's quite a critical part of what we do in this project as well. We very much take a learn by doing approach with this project. It's not a theoretical project. So we're getting out there on the networks, we're using that innovation funding to trial and test different aspects of the smart grid, different aspects of the DSO transition, which I'll talk about in a minute, to see what works, what doesn't, what delivers for customers, what doesn't, and then bring that real world learning back into the project to help realign the ship and alter our direction to something that's actually working. We have some videos on YouTube that we don't have time to play today, unfortunately, but do check them out because they help explain this much better than I could. Next slide, please. Thank you. So the project is quite wide-ranging and covers a range of different topics. And we have basically 6 work streams, which are those 6 blue and green boxes on the right-hand side here. So the first box, which is kind of overlooking or overarching all of it, is what we're calling the DSO transition. So in the UK, historically, the distribution networks are called distribution network operators. We're trying to transition them to distribution system operation, which is effectively looking at moving them from passive asset owners, effectively, to more active operators of their system, including procuring flexibility services, which I'll talk about later. We then have a specific work stream dedicated to flexibility services, and I'll focus on this a bit more later. We have a work stream dedicated to transmission distribution coordination, because at ENA, as I mentioned, we represent T and D. And to do this properly, you need to take that whole systems approach. So that the coordination across T and D is absolutely critical. We have a focus on connection of DER, and how we can get customers connected quicker and easier and improve our connection processes, as well as standardize them across the country. And we have a whole energy systems work stream, which is effectively that joint work stream that I talked about between gas and electricity, to try and understand how we can better promote and better achieve net zero, I should say, by taking that whole systems approach. Good example of this, in the UK, when we have an electricity peak on the network, we typically have a gas peak as well, because all the gas peaking plants have turned on to meet the electricity peak. And finally, but almost most importantly, we have a communications and stakeholder engagement work stream, which is at the bottom there in blue. And that is effectively how we outreach to all of our stakeholders across the UK and Ireland, and how we better explain what we're doing and actually elicit their feedback to, again, make sure that what we're doing is relevant to them and actually works in real life. We called the project Open Networks quite specifically that on purpose, because we want to be open and very transparent about what we're doing. And we want it to be customer driven. Everything we do in the project is effectively completely open and publicly available on our website, including all the cost benefit analysis. Everything we do is up there. And I'll show you how you can access that a bit later. So you can kind of see there down the bottom, it's about collaboration with stakeholders, standardization across the country as much as possible, simplification for customers. Obviously, there's still going to be complexity, but from a customer perspective, how can we make it easier? Transparency, as I mentioned, and fairness. We don't want to leave any part of the country behind or any specific type of customer group behind. So if we move on to the next slide, I'll talk about the DSO transition a little bit. I don't have time to go through every work stream today. Unfortunately, there's an absolute sea of activity. We have around about 40 to 50 products across the project per year. But I did want to focus on the DSO transition and flexibility services, because I think it's quite important from an IESO perspective. So this slide's a bit hectic, but I'll try and simplify it for you. So as I mentioned, the DSO transition is about transitioning to a more active system operation from a distribution perspective, and ensuring that it's more integrated with transmission as well. So back in 2017, which is when the project started, we defined what we meant by DSO and also the functions that a DSO may or may not undertake. We then came up, the next year, we came up with 5 what we called future worlds, and we used a modeling technique called SCAM to develop those future worlds. And those future worlds were basically defining what the role of the ESO was, what the role of DSOs was, what the role of DER was, and how they interacted. And then we basically, next year, we did an impact analysis on those worlds. We basically went through the pros and cons of those worlds, both from a qualitative perspective and a quantitative perspective in terms of costs. We then came up with a range of pathways, which said, actually, this is a least regrets pathway now, but we may actually go in a different direction in the future, depending on what happens in government policy, what happens with DER uptake, how well TMD operators coordinate, etc. But the least regrets pathway was clearly that actually it was what we call our joint procurement pathway, which is where you actually have DSOs and the ESOs, and the ESO, not plural, and the ESO coordinating together and procuring services, both procuring services directly from DER, but coordinating the markets and the services together. And I'll explain a bit more about that in a minute. And once we had that sort of agreed pathway and the least regrets pathway, we then came up with our implementation plan, which we're updating all the time. And the next slide quickly touches on that. Thank you. It effectively is a roadmap for how we're transitioning to DSOs and what the different entities, so what the distribution networks, what the transmission owners, because there are multiple transmission owners, and what the singular ESO are doing in terms of least regrets actions between now and 2030. And we go right down into some quite granular detail of the functions that we're undertaking and when across our membership. So that's an interactive tool on our website that is completely publicly available. I noticed there's a few questions coming out about the slides. Absolutely happy for my slides to be circulated. Okay, so if we move on to the next slide, I'm going to talk quickly about flexibility. So as I said, we've got over 30 gigawatts of DER, of distributed generation connected to our grids, over 500,000 electric vehicles, and an increasing amount of batteries connecting as well. So a lot of our DER is becoming flexible, and flexibility is absolutely critical to achieving net zero, because as we know, most of the renewables, at least in this country, are going to be intermittent. So what that means is that to integrate all of these technologies into the grid, we're going to have a range of different energy markets to facilitate them, and also to encourage them to come onto the grid, to enable them to derive value and access new revenue streams. So some of these markets are existing markets, like a wholesale market, for example. And some of these markets haven't historically existed. So a capacity market is relatively new in this country. Local flexibility markets, which I'll talk about in a minute, are very new. And peer-to-peer trading schemes don't really exist yet, certainly not as business as usual anyway. So the Open Networks project is looking at interfaces between these markets, how they could work together, how T markets and D markets are coordinated, and that's that least regrets pathway, that World B, as well as specifically on local flexibility markets, enabling them and getting them off the ground. So this has been quite successful, because we now have DER in this country providing services to both the ESO and the DSOs. And the local flex markets, as far as we can tell, are the largest in the world. However, I should say that most of the customers playing in these markets and arbitraging between markets, providing multiple services, they are mainly industrial and commercial customers. Residential customers are only starting to dabble, and we really need the retail side of things to help us out with that. But that is one of our focus areas for this year and beyond, is scaling up residential, because that's where there's a huge amount of unlocked flexibility, particularly when you're thinking about, there might be a battery in a home, an electric vehicle, maybe a heat pump, which if combined with thermal storage, or if the house is well sealed, could provide quite a lot of flexibility as well. Okay, next slide, please. So to help enable these local flexibility markets, we made, or our members, I should say, made a flexibility commitment. So within the network's toolbox, as we call it, when you have more demand coming on or more generation, historically, they would just build out more networks. They would reinforce the network. However, as the grid gets smarter and more people have flexible technologies, we have a range of other tools in our toolbox that we can use. So we can use network smart grid solutions like automatic reconfiguration of the network, but we can also use third-party flexibility services, so we can pay someone to relieve the congestion for us. So what we did with this flexibility commitment is we basically said, where there's significant congestion on the networks will go out to the market and see if there's cost-effective flexibility that could relieve that congestion, And if that is lower cost than what the traditional network solution would be, they've committed to procuring that, to basically paying that person to provide that flexibility. And that's the advantage of that Rio regulation model I talked about earlier. Because it's output driven, it's about delivering capacity to customers. We don't actually really care whether it's a network solution or third-party flexibility solution that we procure from a marketplace, because we are basically incentivized to give the customer capacity, not necessarily just put more copper in the ground, for example, or build a new substation. So what does this mean in numbers? If we go to the next slide, please. So we are procuring 4 real power local flexibility services. And when I mean local, I mean at the distribution networks. Most of what we're procuring or have procured today is at 33 kV or 11 kV level. However, an increasing amount of these markets are being set up at LV as well. So we've got individual blocks in London, for example, at a postcode level where we're looking to procure flexibility. So as you can see, we're procuring 4 real power products, effectively schedule constraint management, which is just normal operating conditions when we get congestion, pre and post fault constraint management, and longer term restoration when we have long-term outages, for example. So what we're basically doing is going to the market and saying, we need, typically it's going to be in winter, we need turn up generation or turn down demand. In these specific postcodes, we need this much during 6 to 10 p.m. in winter, for example. Who can provide it and what's your price? And can you do it at a lower cost than the network build solutions? And as you can see, I won't go through all the numbers, but we started this at a very low scale in 2018 as business as usual. And it's scaling up across the year. And this year, we've forecast to put around about 3 gigawatts out to tender. You'll also notice for the eagle-eyed out there, we are also procuring reactive power, which is the 5th column there. That's not really standardized yet, to be honest. That's something we're looking at doing under the Open Networks project, where we are starting to dabble in the DSOs procuring reactive power services for the purposes of voltage control as well. So if we move to the next slide, the way that we're facilitating these markets is that we're basically standardizing the end-to-end process. So right from the upfront product definition, which I just told you about, and the forecasting, through to how we make our needs available. And there's a range of different platforms, which we could spend plenty of time talking about, I'm sure, where people are effectively on our behalf, making our needs visible and enabling the marketplace effectively. Through to the procurement processes, we now have a common contract across all of the DNOs in the UK, through to dispatch, settlement, and fundamentally and very importantly across all of those steps is the reporting. We're not just making the results available of these markets, we're making the methodology available, all of our decision making, etc. If we move on to the next slide, please. So as I said, we're tendering out around about 3 gigawatts this year. However, we are not procuring all of what we need. So I think in our first year, we procured from memory something like 25 to 30% of what we need. And what I mean by procured is I mean signed contract. Last year, I think we got somewhere in the range of 50 to 60% of what we need. But we're clearly not getting all that we need, and we need to increase the liquidity. So the markets are highly locational. So they're, like I said, sometimes it's a block in London. And that means you have a limited pool of resources, physically connected in that area, as you can imagine. However, there are a range of ways that we can increase this liquidity and get more people participating. In some areas, we have no one participating and we don't procure anything. In other areas, we procure more than 100, or there's more than 100% interest in what we put out to tender. So we're working on a range of different ways to increase this liquidity. So innovation trials, which I'll talk about in a minute, defining common products, as I said, making our needs and the ability to access the market easier. As I said, we've got a standard flexibility contract now across all the DNOs in GB, and we're going to be extending that to the ESO Flex contracts as well, hopefully later this year. We're removing exclusivity as much as possible so that people can provide services in different marketplaces. Consistent reporting, we're not being sizeless, so lowering the barriers to entry. Our record, we procured a service from a 600-watt battery, better coordination with the ESO, open data, and critically that stakeholder engagement piece, as I mentioned, getting the word out there, explaining to people how it works, proving it's a consistent revenue stream, building the trust. So I've just got a couple more slides. I realise we've only got 15 minutes left. So as I mentioned, taking a learn by doing approach. So like I said, we started the business as usual, let's call it, local flex markets in 2018, but we had a raft of different innovation projects before that enabled us to get to that point. And we're still running a range of innovation projects to better these markets. So you've got some of them on the screen there. I don't have time to go through all of them, but some of the newer areas we're looking at are creating better ways to access both T&D markets, because at the moment and historically, you've had to have different systems and you have to be quite clever to access these different marketplaces. Looking at things like peer-to-peer trading, looking at those new services like reactive power, harmonic suppression, black start services from DER, etc. We've got a whole suite of innovation projects to just make this better. And where we've got to with these markets, honestly, they're changing all the time. It's not like we got it right perfectly from day one. Like I said, we're taking that learn by doing approach from these projects and building it back into the Open Networks project to make sure that the strategy is better aligned and works for people. Next slide, please. This next slide is our Smarter Networks portal. This is a database of all of the innovation projects that we've ever run within any of the networks since inception, around about 2004, I think it was. So any of those projects on the previous slide, or indeed other projects, jump on this website. You can sign up to emails and weekly newsletters and the like, and you can also search for all of these previous projects and get the information from them. And then the next slide, please. The next slide gives you information about how to get involved in the Open Networks project. So you can join the mailing list, jump on the website. We've got consultations, webinars, all that mailing list, all that sort of usual stuff that you would expect. So, you know, we very much welcome input from other countries as well. We realize that, you know, it's not perfect. We're learning all the time. I work closely, particularly with the Europeans, but I'd love to learn more about what's happening in Canada as well. So do get involved. We'd love to have you on board. So I do believe that's all from me from a presentation perspective, but I'm more than happy to take some questions now.
Fascinating stuff, Randolph. Thank you so much. And I appreciate the sprint to the finish line. And at the end, we do have a few questions here. So I can see a couple of hands raised and quite a few questions that have come in writing. So you know what, maybe those hands are down now. So maybe there aren't the verbal questions, but there are some ones in writing that I'll read out to you here, Randolph. So a few have been majorly upvoted, so I appreciate everybody using that function. So the first question from Craig Walker. The move to low carbon comes at a premium. Historically, governments would rely on the tax base to absorb the premium. How important will private money be in meeting the targets and infrastructure costs?
Yep, so it's a good question. I agree that moving towards net zero is not free. There's no doubt about that. And the government is incentivizing a lot of new innovative low carbon technologies to connect, and we have a range of different schemes to doing that, capacity market, feed-in tariffs historically, things like that. However, I will say that from a networks perspective, with this regulatory system that we have, the RIO methodology, we are incentivized to minimize costs. And we firmly believe that using flexibility instead of just traditional network build solutions will bring those costs down. And in fact, we've proved that already. They are bringing the cost down. Now, that's not to say that the infrastructure isn't still required, because flexibility effectively just pushes your utilization up. There comes a certain point where there's just too much still connecting that you have to invest. However, it can reduce the costs. It can sort of minimize costs as well. But you need, like I said, it's not a case of flexibility or investment. You need both. You need all tools in the toolbox. It's absolutely critical. There's no doubt, though, that you're going to have a combination of the government chipping in and private industry chipping in. At the end of the day, though, if you just wait for private industry, it'll probably be too slow. So what we like to think is that the government can kickstart that private investment, and that's what we've historically seen in the UK.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Randolph, and thanks for the question, Craig. Bill, I can see your hand up. I'm going to call on you in just a moment, but we'll do another written question here, and then we'll jump over to you, Bill. So next question for you, Randolph. Could you elaborate how the shift to the RIO model changed the behavior of DNOs and the system operators?
Yeah, that's a great question. So first of all, innovation. So within our networks, all of them have a super strong culture of innovation. They've all got really large innovation teams, and right throughout the businesses, there's a strong culture of innovation. So that's one thing that RIO has really done. And I know you can probably tell from my accent, I'm originally Australian. I know from my experience in Australia, but also dealing with my counterparts in Europe, that they don't have a lot of that innovation incentivization, and hence they don't necessarily have that culture of innovation within their companies. So that is one critical part that RIO's done. The other thing is with that performance-based or output-based mechanism, we call it TOTEX mechanism. What that has done is it's driven a lot of behaviors towards just finding the lowest cost solution, regardless of whether it's just a build solution or a smart solution or effectively a market solution. And that's why these local flexibility markets are the largest in the world. If you were incentivized to find this lowest cost solution for customers as a monopoly, why would you do it? And a lot of other countries, particularly in Europe, don't have that sort of performance-based incentive. And hence they just haven't done it, because why would they? It's a much safer bet for them to just build more assets. It's what they've done for 100 years.
Fantastic, thank you. And thanks for clearing up the accent question. So I can see, like I said, I saw a hand or two raised. So I see Bill's hand raised. Arturo, would you mind unmuting Bill and allowing him to ask his question? And Bill, I'll let you know, I think you're muted and you'll need to unmute yourself. We're unable to unmute you. Okay, maybe we're having some technical difficulties there. Perhaps, Arturo, we can move on to the next audio question. Harish has a question. And Harish again, yeah. Awesome, thank you.
Hi, I'm Harish. I'm with Alexicon Energy, a distribution company here in Ontario. So my question is on the flexibility markets. So I think the current model in Ontario, they have a congestion component on the wholesale market, and they try to do congestion on the transmission level, and they give congestion credits to resources and procuring them on the transmission level. So what benefits, or have you actually seen any benefits on procuring congestion resources on the distribution level?
I think I got most of your question there, Harish. It broke up a little bit, but I think you were saying, what are the benefits of it happening at distribution versus transmission or wholesale? And I wouldn't think of it as an or, it's an and. So don't get me wrong, like these distributed resources, they are still providing services to the transmission networks, and they're also still arbitraging in the wholesale market. There's absolutely no doubt about that. What these distribution level markets are, is they're effectively just a new revenue stream for the same assets. So what's happened in the distribution network in the UK is that they are designed for an average of 1 to 2 kilowatts per household. That's our design factor. However, with all these new technologies connecting, you know, potentially a 7 kilowatt EV charge point, if you're electrifying your heat, could be between a 5 and 10 kilowatt heat pump maybe. Effectively, there's just a lot more congestion on the electricity networks, particularly in winter. And we can't just build out the networks to account for all of those new technologies. The cost would just be exorbitant, particularly when it comes to heat and electrification of heat. Our gas peak is around about 5 to 6 times our electricity peak. So what we're basically doing is we're relieving that congestion in the distribution network. And if someone can provide a service to relieve that congestion at a lower cost than what it is to build, we're going to pay them to do that. That what doesn't stop them participating in transmission or wholesale markets still. It's effectively a new revenue stream that they can access. Now, it's obviously relatively low value because distribution assets are, compared to transmission assets, are small and potentially not that expensive. Depends where it is. One in the middle of London is pretty expensive. So it's a new revenue stream that they can stack on top of their business model. It doesn't replace anything. It's an additive revenue stream. It's effectively a new market and a new revenue stream.
Makes sense. Thanks.
Hope that answers your question.
Yes, thank you.
Thanks, Harish, for the question. Thanks, Randolph. I think we've got time for another question or two here. So I'm gonna pick one here to read out to you. Okay, this one from Rob Ferguson. So are DERs required to be 100% green energy? Are you able to speak to that a bit, Randolph?
Yeah, so the answer is no. At the moment, to participate in these markets, there is no carbon requirement. We're effectively technology agnostic. So we don't care if it's generation or a battery or demand side response or diesel generator even. The government is investigating whether there should be some carbon element in these markets because they could be, someone could argue they could be seen to be promoting, still fossil fuel generators, for example. But no, at this stage, there's no requirement for these markets. However, there are incentives for people to build renewables, as I said, but not in terms of market participation, not at this stage. It's an active area of debate.
Excellent, thank you. This is probably the last question I'm going to pose to you here, Randolph, from Ron around third-party approaches to supplying flexibility. So question is, are there typical third-party approaches to supplying the necessary flexibility? And if so, are you able to provide some examples, and particularly ones at the scale that you require?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Ron. So on our website, we actually publish, along with those stats of how much we're publishing and for what services, alongside that, we got this big old spreadsheet in there, and it also publishes what the technology mix is for providing those services. And obviously, it varies greatly across the country. It varies by voltage. varies location to location, but I'll give you some examples, Ron. So as I said, most of it is industrial and commercial. That 600-watt battery I talked about was, that's an enigma. Most of it, to be honest, actually is fossil fuel powered generation. So most of it is diesel and gas gensets, to be honest. However, we do have an increasing amount of renewables that are paired with some form of storage, typically battery storage. We also have some hydro providing some of these services. As I said, yeah, increasing amount of storage providing it. Quite a lot of aggregation now as well. And this is typically aggregators or smart suppliers who are aggregating up electric vehicles and demand side response to provide these services as well. But yeah, do look on the website. Like I said, we're technology agnostic, so we've got people turning off fridges in there through to a dirty diesel genset. We are tech agnostic as per the regulation here.
Amazing. Well, that brings us to 10 a.m. Randolph, and I think we'll have to move on to our next agenda item. So just want to say thanks so much for being here. That was a really fascinating presentation. Obviously, a lot of interest with the audience, a lot of great questions. So we really do appreciate you joining us this morning, Randolph. Many thank you. Take care.